Welcome to episode 5 of my Colonizing Minmus series, in which I, an average Kerbal Space Program player, attempt a colonization program in a new science save. In this video, the colonization will finally begin, now that the preliminary scientific research is out of the way. The first part of the video consists of designing and building the combination living quarters science lab for the colony, as well as designing the rocket to launch it. The second half consists of the actual launch and landing of the building on Minmus. One feature I like to have on some of my buildings and space station is rotating searchlights. I've only done this a couple times before, so I had to refresh my memory and test how to re-implement it. Previously I used the CAL controller, although through this testing I discovered an alternate solution just using action groups. I decided to show how I implemented it in case it might serve as an inspiration for any other players. Sometimes I also put the relay dish on the rotating part at an angle to look like a rotating radar dish. I decided not to do that in this case, although I did still include it on the rotating structure itself. First test showed that I had forgotten to lower the RPM. The lights spun very quickly, which was not what I wanted. The second test verified that the lights rotated at a slower speed. The methodology for rotating the lights was ironed out. I began to work on the rest of the building. I wanted to include a science lab as part of the initial structure, so that even when this is the only building in the colony, the Kerbals living there will be able to conduct scientific experiments and have something to do, rather than simply sitting around in their quarters all the time they're on the surface. I had a hard time deciding what to do from there. I knew I wanted multiple hitchhiker storage modules so the initial Kerbal colonists would have plenty of space to stretch their legs without needing to put on spacesuits. Due to the attachment points, the hitchhiker storage pods needed to initially be attached sideways before being rotated into the correct position. I originally thought of adding 4 pods to make the base look like an X from above, but I decided that it made more sense to instead have the cross connections simply be corridors with docking ports attached. This enables the living quarters to be expanded at some point in the future. An additional structure, probably on wheels as well as landing legs, can be maneuvered into place and docked with the existing living quarters, sort of like how in the TV show For All Mankind, the Jamestown moon base was expanded from its original configuration with additional modules. For rotational control, I added 2 additional reaction wheel modules to either side on top of the hitchhiker storage pods. This turned out to be very useful when I landed the base. I don't want to spoil the later part of this episode, but I almost crashed the base into the surface at an odd angle during the final approach. The reaction wheels helped reorient the base so it was vertical as opposed to landing on its side. Not having the nuclear generator unlocked yet, solar panels provide the base with its power, with a lot of batteries to support operating during Minmus's night. I particularly like the look of the largest solar panels, the ones that look like the solar arrays on the International Space Station, so I chose to use them attached to some girders to mimic the appearance of the truss which serves as the backbone of the ISS. Unlike the ISS, the 2 truss elements are oriented vertically. They also serve as locations where the descent engines used to land the base on the surface attach, giving the descent engines a way to detach and be disposed of after the base is in the correct location without needing to remain permanently attached to the base. Kerbal Engineering Redux, I was able to see that two Terrier engines would have a high enough thrust-to-weight ratio to lift the entire base on Minmus. Because the fuel supply was somewhat excessive, the base itself has over a kilometer per second of delta V solely for the landing, when it actually needed much less. I was uncertain of how my landings would go, so I went over rather than under in terms of delta V requirements. The fuel tanks also serve as locations that struts can attach to. The struts are used during the launch and flight to help the base remain stable. Once on the surface, however, most of them are no longer needed, and in fact would prevent the lights from being able to rotate, so they can be disconnected with no ill effects. By attaching the detachable struts to the fuel tanks first, it ensures after they are disconnected, the strut remains attached to the tank, not the base. Used to transit to Minmus is a design I tend to use fairly frequently. The Rhino engine has such great performance that I tend to use it for a lot of heavy lift launch vehicle later stages. I originally was going to use 5-vector engines due to their gimbling range, put in place using an engine plate, but I eventually decided against it in favor of the Mammoth engine, which is essentially 4 vectors, using solid rockets to help get it off the pad. Even though this is a science save and funding is not an issue, in my head I like to imagine that the colonization program planners are still concerned with minimizing costs. SRBs are cheaper than corresponding liquid fuel boosters. Launch is fairly standard, as is the flight to Minmus. I've sped the footage up substantially since the previous episodes have seen me do this several times. Once in Minmus orbit, I adjusted my inclination to pass over the site I identified in the second episode as a likely base location. In my case, I defined that as being flat, as it makes it much easier to land the structures of the base. Then it was simply a matter of waiting until the previous landing site was in daylight. Even though there are lots of lights on the base, I wanted to land when I could see. This also helped as I was trying to conduct a somewhat precision landing, my second ever precision landing near the flag I had planted previously. My first landing attempt failed miserably. I slammed into the surface at a very high speed. I quick loaded back to this point and retried the landing. This is a lot of fine-tuning my landing, looking at the map screen to try and get my trajectory to align with the previously placed flag, looking at the terrain itself, and trying to gauge where I would land. I know there are mods which can show on the surface where the projected landing site is, but I wanted to try and do it myself, like I've seen other KSP players do. In this case, the excessive amount of fuel in the landing stage proved to be very helpful, as it gave me maneuvering room. Earlier in the video about how the reaction control wheels were critical in the landing. I initially touched down at something like a 45-degree angle. Thanks to the reaction wheels and Minmus's reduced gravity, the base didn't immediately topple over, but was able to remain correctly balanced at the odd angle, then able to tilt back to the correct orientation. I initially extended the solar panels, then decided to retract them in case jettisoning the descent stage engines might damage them. I didn't put enough batteries on the engine cores. The first separated and was able to fly away to crash, but the second had all its power drained before separating. I missed seeing it in the resources window. Instead, I used the tracking station to get rid of the main engine as well as the debris from the first. The concept of separating the engines and ramming them into the surface would have worked. I just needed more power and SAS to maintain control due to the engines firing not through the center of mass. for watching my video. In the next episode, I will send the initial inhabitants of the base, as well as the beginnings of an ore refinery.